It is the early hours of June 6, 1944, and the Normandy coastline is wrapped in a darkness so complete that even the sea seems to hold its breath. Somewhere off the coast of Pas-de-Calais, far from the beaches where history is actually being made, a small flotilla of vessels moves with deliberate, almost theatrical slowness through the black water. The men aboard are not commandos. They are not carrying explosives or weapons of any conventional kind. What they are carrying is stranger than that, and in its strangeness, it may be one of the most quietly brilliant deceptions ever executed in the history of modern warfare. From the decks of these vessels, a sound begins to rise. It starts low, barely distinguishable from the wash of the channel against the hull, but it grows, steadily, insistently, into something enormous. The grinding of anchor chains, the throb of mast engines, the bark of orders carried on the wind, the splash of what sounds like thousands of men descending into landing craft. To any German listening post along that stretch of coast, to any frightened young soldier pressing his ear against the cold glass of a field telephone, the sound is unmistakable. A vast invasion fleet is assembling in the darkness. Tens of thousands of men are coming ashore. Except there is nobody there. No fleet, no soldiers, no landing craft. Only the sound, reproduced with such fidelity, broadcast with such power, that it fools not just the ears of the men listening, but the instruments designed to detect exactly this kind of threat. What those British vessels are carrying is a system of specially engineered loudspeakers, powerful amplifiers, and a library of carefully recorded sounds assembled by some of the most technically creative minds the British war effort ever produced. The operation is called Taxable. The technology behind it is part of a broader program so secretive, so unusual, and so far outside conventional military thinking that even today its full scope is not entirely understood. This is the story of the British military's acoustic deception program, of the engineers and officers who built ghost armies out of sound alone, who made German soldiers report phantom tank columns, non-existent troop concentrations, and invasion fleets that existed only on gramophone discs. It is the story of how noise, carefully crafted and precisely deployed, became as potent a weapon as steel. To understand why the British invested so heavily in acoustic deception, you have to understand the particular desperation of the early war years and the specific problem of strategic misdirection. By 1940, it had become devastatingly clear to British planners that the Germans were very good at reading the landscape of war. Their intelligence networks, their aerial reconnaissance, their signals intercepts, all of it meant that conventional camouflage, the business of hiding things by making them invisible, was necessary but not sufficient. You could hide a tank. You could not easily explain the absence of one. What was needed was not just concealment, but replacement. The ability to make an enemy believe something was somewhere when it was not, and to believe that something was absent when it was very much present. The problem with conventional military deception in this period was that it relied almost entirely on visual means. Inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, painted roads. These were valuable, and the British became extraordinarily skilled at manufacturing them, but they had a fundamental limitation. They were static. An inflatable Sherman tank sitting in a field in Kent looks convincing from 30,000 feet. It looks considerably less convincing if a German soldier can hear that the field around it is completely silent. Real tank concentrations are not silent. They are among the loudest things on earth. The shriek of steel tracks on tarmac, the bellowing of diesel engines, the constant radio chatter, the mechanical scream of turrets traversing. A visual deception without an acoustic component is, to anyone paying close attention, obviously false. The British figured this out relatively early, and the solution they developed was, in its conception, almost absurdly simple. Record the sounds of the thing you want to simulate, and play them back loud enough to be convincing. But the execution of that simple idea involved challenges so formidable that it would take several years, the resources of multiple government departments, and the ingenuity of engineers working in conditions of extreme secrecy to solve them properly. The first challenge was fidelity. Recording technology in the early 1940s was not what it is today. Magnetic tape was in its infancy. Most high-quality audio recording still relied on disc cutting, a process that introduced noise and limited the dynamic range of the recording. A tank sounds like a tank in part because of the frequencies it produces, deep, grinding, physical sounds that shake the air and resonate in the chest. Early recordings of tanks, played back through the equipment then available, sounded thin, filtered, unconvincing. They might fool a civilian. They would not fool a soldier who had spent years living alongside armored vehicles. The second challenge was volume. Playing a recording quietly is one thing. Playing it loudly enough to simulate a column of perhaps 200 tanks moving along a road several kilometers away is quite another. The amplifiers required to produce that kind of output did not exist in any commercial form. They had to be designed, built, and tested from scratch, and the loudspeakers capable of handling that output, without distorting at the frequencies that mattered most, presented their own engineering problems of considerable difficulty. The work of solving these problems fell primarily to a group working under the umbrella of what became known as the Special Devices Section, operating in connection with broader deception planning, coordinated through the London Controlling Section and various offshoots of the Special Operations Framework. The specific acoustic work drew on expertise from the BBC, from commercial sound engineers, from physicists at several British universities, and from a small number of remarkably gifted individuals who had previously worked in theatre and film sound. These were people who understood at a practical level how sound creates impression, how the human brain processes acoustic information, and what cues it uses to construct a convincing picture of reality. The solution they arrived at for the fidelity problem was painstaking and methodical. Teams were dispatched to record actual military equipment under controlled conditions, not once, but repeatedly, at different times of day, in different weather, at different distances and angles. They recorded individual tanks. They recorded tank columns. They recorded the sounds of armored vehicles moving through mud, through gravel, across tarmac, across grass. They recorded engines at idle, at full throttle, during gear changes. They recorded the particular acoustic signature of specific vehicle types, the Matilda, the Churchill, the Valentine, because German signals intelligence was sophisticated enough, in principle, to distinguish between them. Every recording was evaluated, compared, discarded, or retained on the basis of how convincingly it reproduced the original. The amplifier problem was solved partly through engineering and partly through brute scale. The devices eventually produced, housed in lorries or mounted on vessels for maritime operations, were capable of outputs that seem almost incredible by the standards of civilian audio equipment. The loudspeaker arrays used in some configurations were the size of small buildings. They could produce sounds audible at distances of 15 kilometers or more under the right atmospheric conditions. A calm night, with the wind in the right direction, could extend that range considerably further. For land-based operations, the equipment was typically mounted in specially modified lorries, fitted with sound-absorbing materials to prevent the mechanical noise of the vehicles themselves from contaminating the broadcast. The lorries would position themselves along a planned route, and the recordings would be played in sequence. First, the distant sounds of an approaching column, then the closer sounds of vehicles passing, then the receding sounds as the simulated force moved away. The timing was critical. Move too fast and the simulation became unconvincing. Move too slowly and the enemy had time to investigate. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational record of British acoustic deception is, by its nature, incomplete. Much of it remains classified or was never formally documented in the first place. Deception operations are not the kind of thing that generates detailed after-action reports, because the value of the deception depends partly on the enemy never knowing it happened. What we do have is a combination of German records captured after the war, the testimony of participants, and the operational logs of the units involved. Fragmentary, sometimes contradictory, but taken together, illuminating. What emerges is a picture of a capability used more widely and more cleverly than is commonly appreciated. During the North African campaign, acoustic simulations of armored concentrations were used to draw German attention and German reserves away from the actual axis of advance. At El Alamein, the broader deception plan of which Montgomery was so proud included acoustic elements alongside its visual and signals components. German commanders in the theatre reported receiving intelligence about armored forces in locations where no such forces existed. Some of those reports were the product of visual deception, some were the product of signals deception, and some, almost certainly, were the product of men who heard engines in the darkness that were not there. In Normandy, the acoustic program reached its most sophisticated expression. Operation Taxable and its companion operation, Operation Glimmer, which used a combination of aircraft dropping metallic chaff and vessels equipped with acoustic broadcast equipment, were designed to simulate an invasion fleet off Pas-de-Calais, while the real landings took place further west. The German 15th Army, stationed at Pas-de-Calais, remained in position for weeks after D-Day, in part because they believed a second, larger invasion was still coming. The acoustic deception was one thread in a complex tapestry, but it was a thread that held. There were failures too. On several occasions, the equipment malfunctioned at critical moments. On at least one occasion, a broadcast vehicle was positioned incorrectly, and the sound reached friendly forces rather than the enemy. The atmospheric conditions that could extend the range of a broadcast could also distort it, producing sounds that were clearly artificial to a trained ear. No deception works perfectly, and the British acoustic program was no exception. The German approach to acoustic deception was real, but significantly less developed. The Wehrmacht experimented with sound simulation as early as 1940, primarily in the context of generating false positions for artillery and mortar fire. They used recordings of artillery pieces to draw counter-battery fire away from actual gun positions, a narrower application than the British program, but one that demonstrated the underlying logic was understood on both sides of the conflict. What the Germans never fully developed was the large-scale, mobile, combined arms acoustic deception that the British achieved. Part of this was a question of priority. German military culture placed enormous emphasis on offensive action and relatively less on the kind of strategic deception that requires months of preparation and produces results that are difficult to measure. Part of it was also technical. German recording and amplification technology in the early 1940s was excellent, arguably superior to British commercial equivalents in some respects, but it was not directed toward this specific application with the same sustained institutional commitment. The Americans developed their own acoustic deception capability, most famously through the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, which operated in the European theater from 1944 onwards. The American program used similar principles to the British one and was in some respects more extensively documented, partly because American military culture was more receptive to after-action analysis. The Ghost Army's acoustic section operated modified half-tracks carrying large speaker arrays, and their broadcasts, which included the sounds of bridge-building operations, armored columns, and troop concentrations, were used on at least 21 known occasions. The Americans were aware of the British program and drew on British experience in developing their own, though the exact channels of that knowledge transfer are not fully documented. What neither the Germans nor the Americans achieved, at least not in this period, was the maritime dimension that the British developed for operations like Taxable and Glimmer. Broadcasting convincing large-scale acoustic simulations from vessels at sea in conditions of wind and wave noise, while maintaining the positional accuracy necessary for the simulation to make geographic sense, was a genuinely difficult technical problem. The British solved it. Nobody else did, at least not during the Second World War. The historical impact of the British acoustic deception program is genuinely difficult to assess, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. Deception operations work precisely because they are invisible. Their success is measured in things that did not happen, decisions that were not taken, forces that were not deployed. You cannot put a number on the men who did not die because German reserves stayed at Pas-de-Calais. You cannot calculate the operational value of an armored thrust that succeeded, partly because the defenders were listening to phantom engines on the other side of the line. What can be said with confidence is that the program influenced every subsequent development in military deception technology. The acoustic simulation systems used by NATO forces during the Cold War drew directly on wartime British research. The concept of electronic warfare, the use of broadcast technology to create false impressions of military reality, owes a significant intellectual debt to the engineers who sat in converted lorries in the darkness of the North African desert, playing recordings of tank engines to confuse German listeners. Surviving examples of the equipment are rare. A small number of the original recording and playback devices are held in private collections and in the archives of institutions connected with wartime signals intelligence. The recordings themselves, the carefully assembled library of armored vehicle sounds, artillery, aircraft, marching infantry, have largely not survived in accessible form, though researchers have located fragments in several national archives. And so we return to the Channel in the early hours of June 6, 1944. The small flotilla moves through the darkness off Pas-de-Calais, and the sound of an army rises from the water. German signal stations report a major naval concentration. German commanders reach for their telephones. German reserves begin to move toward a threat that does not exist, and will not exist, and never existed except in the carefully engineered acoustic imagination of a group of British engineers who understood something fundamental about the nature of warfare in the modern age. War is not only what you can see, it is what you can make the enemy believe. It is the story you tell in the darkness, with whatever instruments you have available. And in June of 1944, the British were telling that story with gramophone discs and amplifiers and speaker arrays built from scratch by men whose names are almost entirely unknown, working on a problem that most military thinkers did not yet understand was a problem at all. They built armies out of sound. They built fleets out of recordings. They built victories out of silence. The silence of German divisions standing still, waiting for an enemy that would never come, while the real enemy was already ashore. The ghost tanks were never there, and that, in the end, was precisely the point.